Hello, and welcome to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. My name is Derek McCush. Greece is a destination country for many refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants from the Middle East and North Africa. The majority of these refugees come from Syria, Afghanistan, Egypt, and Eritrea. And Greece currently hosts about 50,000 refugees. Now, they may have expected that Greece would be a gateway to the rest of Europe, but most of them can expect to remain in the country since they can no longer legally travel deeper into Europe. Since 2021, many of the refugee arrivals have been detained in what are called closed, controlled access centers, which are similar to prisons. They have inadequate food, minimal and overcrowded housing, and they're surrounded by fencing and watched over by security personnel. In this episode of Human Rights Magazine, Nell Pollak looks into the situation in these closed, controlled access centers.
Today we are delving into a critical and ongoing humanitarian issue, the refugee crisis in Greece. Specifically, we'll be focusing on the Controlled Access Centers, or CCACs, and the inhumane barriers that refugees face in seeking EU refuge. To guide us through these topics, we'll be hearing from three experts who work directly with asylum seekers in Greece. These voices include Irini Getinou from Refugee Support Aegean, Yunus Mohammadi from Greek Forum for Refugees, and Eladad from I Have Rights Samos. Their insights will shed light on the reality of life inside the CCACs and the broader systemic challenges that asylum seekers face in Greece. Let's begin by discussing the concept of de facto detention within the controlled access centers. The Greek government refers to CCACs as reception centers, but in practice they function much like detention facilities. The severe restrictions imposed on the freedom of movement for asylum seekers effectively turn these centers into places of de facto detention, contradicting the EU principle that detention should be a measure of last resort. Our first expert is Eladad, a legal coordinator at I Have Rights, a non-profit organization that addresses unjust and undignified asylum procedures.
So this regime of detention is still in place. So people will arrive to Samos. If they're not pushed back, they will be taken to the Samos CCAC. Their phones are taken by the police before they arrive, and then they will be detained into the facility. A few days after they've arrived, they will be given an order, a restriction of freedom order. They don't call it a detention because it would be illegal to detain people in this way. So they call it a restriction of freedom order. It's like me punching someone and saying, I didn't punch you, I just touched you really hard.
Yeah. And that means that they're not allowed to leave or get any legal counsel.
They absolutely cannot leave. So this is why it's called the de facto detention, because legally they're not calling it a detention, but in every other way it is one. And this is actually so illegal that the EU, the European Commission, has even opened infringement proceedings against Greece because this violates EU law. So after a few days of people being detained, they're given this restriction of freedom order, which essentially said we will restrict your freedom, i.e. we will detain you for up to 25 days or until the registration process is completed. It doesn't take into account the fact that people might have already been detained in the facility for 5 days. And so what we see is that people are risk being detained for a month, maybe even 2 months, depending on how quickly they get this restriction of freedom order. It's very, very difficult to challenge detention. If people are lucky, they may be able to access the lawyers that are inside the facility. There's only 2 of them, though, and it's not so easy to move within the facility. And MSF doesn't have access to every single section. So it leaves people alone.
Ella's description paints a deeply disturbing picture of the illegal and informal policies that characterize these reception centers. The reality is that many asylum seekers are effectively imprisoned without due process, a policy that violates European law. This deprivation of freedom is compounded by the severe lack of resources within the CCACs. Refugees often find themselves without adequate food, clothing, or medical care, which only exacerbates the suffering of those who have been forced to leave their homes. Next, we hear from Yunus Mohammadi, the director of Greek Forum for Refugees, which was an organization founded by refugees for refugees. Originally from Afghanistan, Yunus has been a vital advocate for asylum seekers in Greece for over 2 decades.
So the first person that I spoke, it was yesterday, that he is in Samos and he is living 4 months is center. And when I asked that what is the greatest problem that they have, it is that it is overcrowded first. It is 4,000 and 5,000 people that they are living in the center. And access to health, it is one of the biggest issues that the centers. Of course, it means that they can't go in and go out and come in. This uncertainty for them, which is they don't know when they will leave this center, and the shortage of the food. Always there is a fighting on the queues for food and for health. It is the problem that they have, and they said that, for example, for the children, when they are sick, if there is a need of syrup for them, not giving a bottle of syrup for one child, they divide it in many pots inside a syringe, and they give in different families one bottle of syrup. They divide it for many children in different families that they give. So it is the lack of medicine, so the lack of doctors itself inside the centers. So that's the problem, that sometimes we are not, if you ask the organization, most of them, they are not speaking about it. They don't speak about this.
This lack of essential resources isn't just about physical discomfort. It's a matter of survival. When basic needs cannot be met and movement is restricted, the consequences for already vulnerable populations can be devastating. The heavy reliance on NGOs to provide what the government does not only highlights the failure of the Greek government and the EU to meet its obligations under international law. It also underscores the dire conditions that people are forced to endure while waiting for their asylum claims to be processed. The physical barriers faced by asylum seekers are matched by the severe psychological toll of their journey and the conditions within the CCACs. Many arrive deeply traumatized by violent pushbacks and face even further stress and anxiety once inside the camps.
People are affected psychologically most of the time. Such centers, when they are getting out, have cases that actually they got their even permanent psychological problem just because of the conditions in these closed centers or detention centers. So it is not just this year, it is for so long years. It is happening, and there are many cases that still it exists in different other countries, that they are taking medicine. They are under medication just because of this situation that they have passed here in Greece in detention center.
So, Samos sees the second highest rate of pushbacks in the Aegean. Lesbos sees the most. Pushbacks are continuing. They are a de facto policy of the Greek authorities. Around a third of our clients report to have experienced at least one pushback. We suspect that figure to be much higher. There's just a lot of work needed to be building up trust with people when they're living in such an isolated. It's also important to emphasize that that pushbacks don't only violate the principle of non-refoulement, so that you shouldn't be returning people without assessing whether it's safe for them to be returned. But that pushbacks also involve people being murdered, people being raped, people being illegally detained. There's a report out from BVMN recently, which was to do with a failed pushback from Samos, where a pregnant woman had a gun held to her head so that people would stop screaming. I mean, the level of violence and horrific levels of torture that happen during these pushbacks are also really, really important to talk about. And the impact that has on a facility like the Post Control Access Center is that people arrive into that facility having either experienced the pushback themselves or being in an absolute state of terror that it could happen to them. And then their phones are taken and then they're detained and they're surveyed. And so it's, I think, part of this broader infrastructure, coercion and control.
Ella and Eunice's accounts highlights the continuous cycle of trauma that asylum seekers are forced to endure, from the moment they attempt to enter European borders to their prolonged detention in the CCACs. This relentless fear and anxiety have severe implications for their long-term mental health. Women and unaccompanied minors are among the most vulnerable populations within the CCACs. The lack of adequate protection and support for these groups exposes them to significant risks and exacerbates their trauma. Now let's hear from Irini Getinou, a government coordinator at RSA, an organization dedicated to defending the rights of refugees and asylum seekers in Greece. Irini has been closely monitoring the situation in the camps, particularly the treatment of vulnerable groups.
Seeing problems in different aspects of treatment of vulnerability. One thing is that there is a significant problem with assessment of vulnerability. And this is basically because we have a huge understaffing of medical personnel in the camps. So assessment must be done by medical personnel, of course, and with the provision of interpretation, and also with all what is necessary in order for the person who is vulnerable to be able to share his or her experience. We have seen that first we have huge percentages of vulnerable persons, which is of course understandable because these people have passed through a lot to be able to find themselves here. So we have a total of about 15% of the total population who has been assessed as vulnerable when in reception and identification procedures. This is an obligation from the state. So when a person registers his or her asylum claim, it is obliged, if he or she speaks of some vulnerability, the state is obliged to pass through, when in reception and identification procedure, to pass through a vulnerability assessment. And we have seen that there is a severe lack of medical personnel to make this assessment. On the islands, in many islands, we have not even one doctor. So we have no doctors, no doctors to give medical assistance, of course, which is first, but also no doctors to make vulnerability assessment. So we have units from the national organizations that visit occasionally the islands in order to make vulnerability assessments, which is of course not enough. It's not adequate. We should have staff which is permanently in the camps and who do this vulnerability assessment each time that it's needed. You can see also in the report on the mainland, we have written down all healthcare staff camps, which is evidently extremely not enough. For example, in Corinth, which is a big camp, we have only one staff, not doctor, the whole healthcare staff for more than 700. This is extremely inadequate, and this has huge consequences in assessing vulnerability for the people that are actually vulnerable and need, of course, to follow institutions for social support, for medical support, etc. The second problem is that we don't have actually special reception conditions for people that have been assessed as vulnerable. As I said, we only have camps. In the previous years, we didn't have only camps. We also had the Estia program, which was a program providing flats to the people, small flats, houses in the cities, providing also special residence when needed. And we also have hostels, structures, especially for vulnerable people. At this point, accommodation in refugee camps is the sole form of housing, including vulnerable people. So, of course, they cannot actually provide the special reception conditions that are needed in the camps. We also know that these camps, which also host vulnerable people, face critical shortages in medical personnel regarding security issues, provision of basic rights. They are not placed in special conditions or places in the camp, so this absence of measures cannot, it emerges in even extremely vulnerable cases, and it cannot cover their basic rights.
The absence of proper facilities and care for these vulnerable groups is alarming. It speaks to a broader failure in the system that is supposed to offer protection and support to those who need it most.
So unaccompanied children are detained in a subsection of the facility, which is essentially a prison within a prison. It's a barbed wire surrounded area that's within a barbed wire, layers and layers of barbed wire. They are confined or detained to that part of the CCAC that is it's the so-called safe zone for all hours of the day. I think there's 8 hours a day that they're allowed to leave for free time, where they can go to the playground in section A of the facility. So they're the whole time detained, essentially. The only times they're able to leave is if they have to go to the hospital and they have to be escorted by police. So this just gives you an indication of how these extremely vulnerable people, children, are being treated in this like a highly securitized facility. The ministry says that they don't need to create more suitable accommodation for them because this is only a temporary time. I do believe they only stay there for don't take it back. I do believe that they are there for around a month or two, but even a day for me is absolutely unacceptable and inappropriate for unaccompanied children. Then for women, there's meant to be a section for women only, or a section for single female-headed households. But for the last year, at least, that section has been used to accommodate the general population of the facility. So, for example, we were working with a woman earlier this year who has experienced very serious human rights violations that I don't have consent to share, is that she was required to share a bunk bed, with an unrelated man. This is just the level of disregard to the acute vulnerabilities and distinct detection needs that, women and children need.
These conditions not only violate basic human rights, but also further entrench the trauma experienced by these vulnerable populations. The lack of gender-sensitive policies and facilities in these camps is a glaring oversight that urgently needs addressing. One of the underlying issues in the treatment of refugees in Greece is the systemic discrimination based upon nationality. This post-colonial mindset results in a double standard where some refugees receive better treatment and opportunities than others.
So even in media and even the society, they have accepted that, the Ukrainians are different because they are white, they are Europeans, they are Christians, so they should have another behavior. Of course, what Europe did for Ukrainian, it was the best. And we agree with that. It should be extended to others. Actually, 5 million Ukrainians, they came. And even Europe, they didn't understand. We didn't understand the crisis. And they managed it very well in terms of accommodation, documentation, job market, everything. Because there was a political force. We don't have, actually, from 2015 till now, we have 2 million other refugees from others. So I always call it refugee crisis. So there is not a problem that you are Ukrainians or you are non-Ukrainians. The problem is the crisis management, the management crisis, the way that Europeans are facing humanitarian crisis. They are not approaching humanitarian crisis according to human values, but just according to political interest, according to their other kind of interest, which creates problem on the ground as well. One of our work is actually how to raise awareness actually that what has been done for the Ukrainians, it was the best, it was good. But we don't say that why they did it for Ukraine, we call that why they don't do it for others.
The disparities in treatment are not just coincidental. They are part of a larger narrative of exclusion and control that is rooted in historical and racial biases.
As for nationalities, well, we don't work with Ukrainian people, so we don't know firsthand how they are dealt. We have seen of them. They have been dealt in a different way than other refugees. They have every 6 months or a year the ministry renewing access to all rights, and they are not hosted in the same conditions with other refugees. So yes, I think that this is something that we can say. What we also see in terms of nationality is that from when the third country concept has been applied intensely in Greece, we have a policy which is hugely problematic, which says that every individual, every claim is not examined individually, but based on nationality country. This is a violation because every asylum claim must be viewed individually. Since applying the third country concept, we've seen that based on nationality, if you are from these nationalities which are perceived that should be dealt with in a third country, your asylum claim is not even examined, which is a respective violation as well.
Irini's insights underscores the importance of addressing these systemic issues. The current policies reflect a prioritization of security and convenience over human rights and dignity. The refugee crisis in Greece is not just a story of systemic failures and deep-rooted discrimination. It is a story of innocent people trying to forge new lives for themselves, yet being treated in the most cruel and inhumane way, facing barrier after barrier. From the harsh conditions in the CCACs to the lack of integration policies, the current approach prioritizes control and exclusion over humanity and compassion. The shared knowledge of those directly involved remind us of the urgent need for change, and to remember that this is not simply a matter of policy, but of human rights. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. The podcast is brought to you by the Upstream Journal. I invite you to consider supporting the program and the magazine with a contribution through PayPal as you explore other episodes.